Hello everyone. Today I'm going to do a tutorial video using the effect size calculator on a different design and statistic. Today we're going to be doing design 1 for t-test values. The design 1 once again is when you're comparing two groups, an intervention and a control group, or experimental and control group, with pre-test and post-test data for each. So it's going to be using 4 time points, pre-test, post-test, and experimental compared to pre-test, post-test, and the control. And today we're going to be doing an example for using t-test. So it's going to be using 2 t values, 1 t-test value measuring the t-test change from pre-test to post-test in the experimental group, and 1 measuring the change from pre-test to post-test in the control group. So we're going to open up our Excel file here, which you can download. If you haven't done this already, like our previous examples, you're going to create an effect size calculations tab to go along with this calculator tab. You can highlight these 2 tabs to help them stand out so you know which ones you're using. Also, like I've said before, basically what you're doing is you're pulling calculators from this tab to build a database on this tab. So you're never actually entering anything on this tab. These are just a resource to copy the calculators over to this tab as you input effect sizes. So what we're going to do first is we're going to take these first 4 rows, we're going to copy, and we're going to paste here. I'm going to zoom out for visibility. Now I'm going to bring up our study, which you can download within the video description. It will provide a link. Study from 2011. And I'm going to scroll down to the results and give you a basic overview of the study and the statistics. So here's the table we're going to be using that has the results. I actually rotate this table, rotate the page. And looking at this table, you can see there's an intervention and control group. This group right here is the intervention group. And this group right here is the control group. So all the data under this heading is data for the intervention group pre to post and the control group pre to post. So what you can see here is baseline, mean, and 3-month mean for the experimental group, and baseline, mean, and 3-month mean for the control group. There's no standard deviation, so without a standard deviation you actually can't calculate an effect size using just the means. You can use the mean and the confidence intervals, which are given here, but given just the means you can't calculate. So for this example we're going to use the t-test. So we're going to undo those highlights because we're not going to use those means. If you look in this column and this column, you're going to see the sample size used for each measure. The measures are actually listed over here. And if you look over here, you're going to see the t-values for baseline to 3-month. So here you have a sample size. And here you have a t-test that's measuring the change from baseline to 3-month in the experimental group. So this is the experimental pre-post t-test value. Looking over here in the control group, this is the sample size. And this t-test value right here is giving you the pre to post test change in the control group. So now we've identified the information we're going to be using. We're going to be inputting for the knowledge scale for this example. And we'll actually do the counting view self-efficacy scale just to give you a couple examples. So we're going to highlight the same information. So now all the information you're going to need is actually highlighted, all the data. So I'm going to bring the screen back up. So like I said, we know we're using design 1 because we're looking pre-test to post-test change in the experimental versus pre-test to post-test in the control. So here's our design 1. And now we know we're looking at t-test values given these columns, obviously the t statistics we're looking at. So then within this you're going to find the t-test statistic, which is right here. Go over into this tab, We're going to paste here. And as I go over in the other videos, you're going to actually want to enter all the data going along in this row. You can minimize here so you can view the study and the Excel file. So this manuscript column, you're going to use the arbitrary identifier for your study. Ours happens to be KLE004. You may or may not have an identifier. This is just the way we categorize our studies. Klein et al. 2011 is the reference. So this is just a brief reference to refer to the author and the year the study was done. Stats or t-test, which is input into the calculator, design 1. So that's what we copied over. Subgroup. Enter the two groups being compared, in this case the multimedia group versus the control group. There's no other subsets such as sexually active participants only, African Americans only, etc. We're using the entire intervention group versus the control group, so you enter that here. Follow-up is going to list the number of delayed follow-ups. So you start, the first delayed follow-up in the study is numbered 1. The second delayed follow-up is number 2. Third is number 3. So as you move forward and as you move through the delayed follow-ups, the numbers succeed each other. So this study only has one delayed follow-up, and it's the 3-month follow-up, which we're using. So you're going to put 1 here to indicate the first delayed follow-up, and in this case the only delayed follow-up. And then here you're going to put 12-week follow-up. This column denotes the weeks that the follow-up is. Since it's 3 months, we consider each month 4 weeks, so 3 times 4 is 12 weeks. Here we're putting our measure, so we're using the knowledge scale for this first measure. As I've said in other videos, outcome column you're going to leave blank for now. It's going to depend on how you categorize your entire data set in the end and how you want to group effect sizes together and measures together to create composites. So right now this is not important. These two columns have to do with control variables. The study actually does not use control variables in their calculation of statistics, so we're going to leave those blank. This column right here is just having you put in where you got the information. So looking down here, it's page 573, and at the top of the table, table 2. So we're going to put that in here. So now we actually put in the data that we're entering in for the study. So just to give another brief overview, these 6 columns, as noted here, are for the experimental data, and these 6 are for the control data. These 3 correspond to pre-test experimental data, and these 3 respond for post-test experimental data. And then you look over here, and these 3 correspond for pre-test control data, and these 3 are post-test control data. So as you can see, only 2 cells are highlighted for the experimental and the control group at the post-test. So since the t-test, we're only using 1 value to measure the pre to post-test change in each group. So these pre-test columns have no values of use as we calculate our effect size. So within the experimental control group, they're actually not important and not going to be, anything's going to be entered into them. But looking at the post-test, this end post column is going to give you the sample size at follow-up for the experimental and the sample size at follow-up for the control. And looking here, highlighting in the formula bar is the t value for the pre to post test change in the experimental. You're going to put here. And for the control, highlighted in the formula bar, as noted in the column heading, the t value here for pre to post test change in the control. So if you're thinking of our previous examples, there's actually 2 cells highlighted for post-test data when it's experimental control post-test. And for instance, like means and standard deviations, that's because there's actually two values in those cases. The mean would go here, and the standard deviation for the experimental, and the mean and the standard deviation for the control. But since it's only the t-test, there's only one value, there's not two values. So that's why you only need this one column for each and the one sample size for each. So looking up here in the study, the knowledge scale, this is the multimedia group. Knowledge scale is the first row. The N here being reported is 83 that's being used. So we're going to put 83. The T value is going to be 8.58. And over here we're looking 76 is the sample size for the control group, denoted as N, and the t-test value 2.93. So now looking over here, you're going to have experimental effect size data in these columns, control effect size data in these columns, and experimental versus control data in these columns. So maximizing the screen, as you can see, this experimental effect size from this column, the D, is using the sample size and the t-test for the experimental group. So that's how it's calculating a pre to post effect size for the experimental group. And the control is doing the same thing with the control data is highlighted here in those cells. So it's using that data, the sample size and the t-test value. And then this effect size for experimental versus control is comparing the two. So subtracting the control from the experimental effect size to note the difference. So as you can see, the effect size for the experimental is larger than the effect size for the control. When you subtract them, you get 0.6, indicating that compared to the control over time, the experimental group did a better job of improving knowledge compared to the control. And once again, going through, there's other important data that you'll report in your final database. The variance for the experimental group pre-post, the weight for the experimental pre-post, and the lower and upper confidence interval for the experimental pre-post. Here's the variance for the control pre-post, the weight for the control pre-post, and the confidence interval for the control pre-post. And the same information here, variance, weight, and lower and upper confidence interval for the experimental versus the control group. So we did one there, and just to show you how you're going to build a database and how these all add up. We're going to look at this outcome next, economy self-efficacy scale. So we're going to go back on this screen, calculator tab, design one t-test again since we're using the same type of information. Copy it over into your effect size calculations tab. So we're going to copy over a lot of this information as it's repeated. The manuscript ID and the reference are the same because it's the same study. So we'll copy those down. You're comparing the same two groups, the multimedia group versus the control group for this measure as well. So you're going to click here and you're going to copy and paste this down to the next row as well. The follow-up is the same because you're still working with the 3-month follow-up. So the follow-up here, first delay, follow-up weeks, 3-month. The measure is what's going to be different. So here's a knowledge scale on the first measure. Now we're looking at condom use self-efficacy. Once again, no outcome to be input for now. That will be in a future video, and for when you finish your database, you'll decide things of that nature. Control variables, once again, there's none listed in the study. This column right here is going to tell you where you got the data from. Same place, same table. Once again, no pre-test data needed for the experimental or the control. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to enter the same data. So here you see 79 for the experimental sample size, 1.62 for the t-test, 79 for the control sample size, looking here in the table, and 1.72 for the t-test value there. So you have an effect size here for the experimental pre-post of 0.18 and 0.19 for the control group, highlighted here. So this number is actually negative now, and this is denoting that the control group in this case actually increased condom use efficacy more than the experimental group, although as you can see it's a negative 0.01, so that's a very minimal amount of difference. So that's going to conclude this video. As you add the rest of the t-tests in this table, you're just going to keep copying and pasting t-test calculators in here as you do each measure. So in a lot of ways, the easiest way to do it is to do a bunch of them at once and copy all the repeated information in. For example, you'd copy this over for the next 4 measures and the same comparison over for the next 4 measures, and the same follow-up for the next 4 measures. And then you copy this too, because it's all coming from the same place. And then you would just put in the different variable names here, different measures being reported in the table.